Hello, friends. Today we're going to continue with our series of Narcissism in Astrology, and we're going to be covering the role of Saturn. And Saturn, not from the psychology of the narcissist, but we're going to be looking at what the narcissist fears the most, and that is the structure of reality itself. And we have to remember, Saturn represents reality, which includes its limits, its truth, and its boundaries. We have to understand this archetype in order for us to understand why the narcissist has certain reactions and why they think the way they do. Because at its core, narcissism is a refusal of reality. And if you're interested in seeing more of the episodes that are going to be upcoming for this series, please remember to subscribe so YouTube sends you a notification. And if you want to know how we arrive to Saturn as reality and narcissism, there are a number of other videos in a playlist on YouTube called Narcissism in Astrology, and I have already covered the Sun, Moon, Mercury, and Venus. And you would think naturally we should be jumping into Mars and then Jupiter and then Saturn, but we're going to come back to Saturn again. And I do want to say one more thing before we go forward. I am not a clinician, so I'm not giving you the type of information which would allow anyone to diagnose someone as a narcissist. It's a complicated personality disorder, and you literally need a clinician to do that. What we're trying to do right now is to understand the symbolic architecture of this disorder. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. And just to go back to why I'm covering Saturn first. As I was saying, the next natural planet is Mars after Venus. And we have a lot to talk about when we get there because there's this component of narcissism that's called narcissistic rage that's related to Mars. There's a lot of aggression and retaliation there. But what we have to understand is that Mars is not creating those reactions. Mars is a reaction to something else. So to understand narcissistic rage, we have to first understand what it is that injures the narcissist, and so profoundly and so chronically and so predictably that it's indicating that there's something constant underneath it all. And that injuring force is coming from Saturn. In actuality, Saturn is what the narcissist is fighting all the time. Mars is indicating how they are doing the fighting. And at the end, we're going to come back to Saturn, but from the internal perspective of the narcissist. So inside the psyche, so that we understand those other tendencies in this disorder, which has a lot to do with being sadistic. But in this episode, we're going to be looking at what it is. What is that constant ground that is keep pushing the narcissist to behave and act and react the way they do? Which again, it's Saturn itself and the way Saturn represents reality. And the way I want us to continue this talk, I'm going to take a minute to define what I mean by reality here, especially in the context of narcissism. A lot of us just use that word very casually without really taking the time to understand what it's indicating. So when I'm talking about the word reality right now, I'm not referring to our interpretation of events or our emotions and how we feel, or the stories that we tell about ourselves, other people, and the experiences that we have. All of those factors belong to the realm of subjectivity, which is actually moon symbolism. Reality here is something different. Reality exists before you and outside of you, regardless of your perception and interpretation. For instance, reality is the external world, and it's independent of our perception for its happenings. It's independent of our needs, independent of our fantasies. It's something that is a constant, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. So reality is the structure that continues with or without our perception. And that's what Saturn is representing as reality. And we have to remember that our subjectivity actually comes after reality, because subjective experience is personal and fluid. It's influenced by our memories, by trauma, expectations, fears, desires, and is just internally generated. And the point here is subjectivity is formed within the parameters of reality. For instance, we don't create the world through our perception. The world is actually shaping our perception. And it's from that we understand how we can become these active agents and creative agents. So the mind is constantly adapting to the external structure that precedes it. And we might be asking, okay, why are we laboring over this right now? Why does this understanding matter? And that's because a healthy psyche accepts that I am just one participant in the world, and the world doesn't belong to me. My feelings are real to me, but they are not reality itself. And most importantly, this is where narcissists struggle the most. A healthy psyche accepts that my desires have to negotiate with the conditions of the world, and a world that is not of my making, a world that does not belong to me, nor does it bend to my desires. A healthy psyche understands this very naturally, and it could be at friction with it, but it understands it. But the structure of the narcissist psyche cannot tolerate this truth. In fact, the narcissist requires an opposite kind of a structure to this. So this is how the narcissist thinks. Let me describe this. Reality must adapt to me. My perception must overrule objective truth. My desires should override all kinds of limits that are in the world. And my subjective world is the only legit world, is the only one that's valid. So if you think about it, this inversion is prioritizing fantasy over reality. And this is the foundation of narcissism. And I explained this extensively in episode 1, where I talked about the sun and the moon. And because of what I just described, this is why Saturn is such a threat to this personality disorder. And that's because Saturn represents the original order. And that means the world exists first. Limits exist first. Truth exists first. Cause and effect with its consequences exist first. They take priority. They're the structure of reality. And in a healthy mind, the psyche understands these factors and it's able to adapt. So the psyche comes second. So Saturn is constantly reminding us of the correct hierarchy. And this is something that the narcissistic mind and personality structure cannot tolerate. So now let's go to point 2, because we just established what reality is. But let's see what it is about reality that the narcissistic mind collapses under it. And why is it that Saturn becomes Narcissist's greatest antagonist? And in this section, I really want to talk about Saturn representing limitations, especially what that means for the self, and then how the narcissist comes to interpret this. So first of all, Saturn's representing that part of existence that hasn't been created just to move for us. So it's showing us our limits. For instance, it's symbolizing the limit of our competence and our knowledge, the limit of our power, the boundaries of our identity, and the structure of worlds that remains very much outside of our control. And what that means is that reality is constantly pushing back against us because we have these desires, we have a will, we are these active agents in the world. We want to get somewhere, we have goals. But Saturn, every time you want to achieve a goal, you feel Saturn pushing back against you. It's always showing you your limits. And the thing is, Saturn's considered harsh because it represents reality. Reality never softens up for us. It doesn't adjust itself to accommodate our narrative. And it doesn't bend simply because we desire it to. I know there's that concept of The Secret. You can bend reality based on your subjective desire, thinking, and feeling. But if you actually pay attention, this is not what's happening. And a healthy psyche understands this. And it's able to integrate this as an actual fact of the world and not suffer from it. It actually becomes the friction, becomes like the thing that actually allows you to grow, become more wiser, stronger. And when it comes to the narcissist, their psyche cannot even come close to understand this. So now we have to ask, what is it about the narcissist personality structure that can't tolerate the limits of reality? In general, the narcissist has a lot of hard time accepting any limits. And again, I explained this extensively and I'll say it here now. The narcissist self is actually a fantasy. In reality, the self of the narcissist doesn't exist. It was never formulated, never configured, never rooted. And this fantasy self of the narcissist is built on the premise of kind of being godlike. It is unlimited. Like a narcissist cannot acknowledge inadequacies or some sense of insecurity without feeling like they're being annihilated. A narcissist cannot tolerate being ordinary. Ordinary life feels like an insult to them. An ordinary life, I mean, if you think about it, 99% of our lives are ordinary, and I don't care who you are. You have to go to the bathroom, sit on it, and push like any other human being. You have to wash yourself. You have to get dressed. You have to get into your car. You have to bear the traffic. This is mundane. This is ordinary. And most of life is about that. This is an insult to the narcissist's sense of self. And there's another thing. Narcissists cannot admit that they need the world or other people. They have created the self that's in a fantasy where everyone else needs them, where they are extraordinary. And this creates a problem because that means they cannot integrate feedback from the world. Every time there's a feedback, they collapse. Like the cause and effects of reality with its consequences is a complete insult to the narcissist's fantasy self. Like, how dare does the world have a consequence, an effect for what I just caused that is not in accordance to my desire? This is insanity if you think about it. They will do the most outrageous and hurtful acts, and then they're expecting the consequence and the result not to be something negative coming back to them. So as you can see, Saturn, as the force that it is, in the symbols that it has, at every turn, it contradicts and challenges the false self of the narcissist. Like the narcissist thinks of themselves as something very grand. A lot of narcissists have the Messiah complex, especially if they are grandiose and extroverted. Overt narcissists. The rules of the world cannot apply to them. And when it does, it's an insult to their sense of self. And Saturn's constantly reminding the narcissist, like constantly, this is what reality is doing to it. You're a lot smaller than you believe. You are limited. You are finite. There are things that you cannot do and will never do. There are things that you cannot become and you will never become. There are truths that you cannot change. And narcissists love changing truth because they confabulate all the time. They have these memory gaps. They make up parts of the story as they go. And then you're like, that's not what happened. And people call that gaslighting, but they actually believe what they're saying. So it's not gaslighting, it's confabulation. The point here is we all encounter this. We all negotiate with this friction of life. At best, we try to become better. And at other times, we let life humble us and we come to some sort of an acceptance. For the narcissist, no, this is absolute humiliation. This fact about the world creates internal humiliation about their sense of self. And this humiliation for the narcissist is most intensely felt when these limitations are being expressed by other people. And with that said, let's go to section 3, where we're going to be talking about Saturn as boundary. I have to say, you probably noticed that the frame change, I look a little bit different. This is the next day. While I was recording, the recording stopped halfway through. So now I'm doing the second part now. But let's get right into it. The first thing to understand, that Saturn, or the symbolism of Saturn as reality, is saying something about the separateness that exists in the world. Saturn's what creating the distance between the self and the other. That means when it comes to other people, when it comes to nature of reality, other people have their own independent thoughts. They have their own interpretations and they have their own needs. And another part of reality and the separateness is that others do not have to reflect our self-image of the way we hold our own image back to us. And when someone has a healthy mind, they understand this dynamic. They'll even respect it. But to a narcissist, this facet is intolerable. In fact, the very existence of other people becomes the sharpest point of reality. And that's because others begin to mirror their inconsistencies. The other can start to expose their inadequacies, incompetence. And if you think about it, it's really easy to just sit somewhere and think that we're perfect when we're by ourselves. But when we come into that friction with other people and that relational dynamic, that we start to see the truth about ourselves. Because of those interactions, the narcissist can't tolerate this. So in the narcissist world, every person becomes a Saturnine boundary. And we'll talk about this in the next episode. A lot of the rage is actually coming from this because the narcissist has this grandiose image of itself, of who it is, what it's about, what its capabilities are. It's when it comes into relation to others that this contrast becomes very sharp. And the narcissist needs to protect itself from that because there is a false self there. I'll explain this shortly. But it's important to remember, this is also another reason why the narcissist can't have empathy. And that's because for me to, let's say, to empathize with you, when I tell you, hey, these are my desires, and you're like, you know what, that doesn't correspond to my desire. In fact, what you're requesting of me hurts me. A person with empathy can very quickly shift into their perspective and try to see what it is that they're experiencing. The narcissist can't do this. And that's because to empathize with another is to acknowledge another. That means another world exists, another perspective exists. And the narcissist cannot do this because no one can exist independently of the narcissist. The narcissist is the alpha and the omega in their own mind. And the narcissist cannot do this because this is demonstrating to it that, hey, you actually don't have the kind of power you think you do, not in the world and not even within yourself. And if you were to go inside the processing system of this kind of a mind, you'll see that the narcissist sees other people as a constant obstacle that they need to overcome. This is why there's this perpetual aggression almost towards the most benign things and expressions. This is why connections are always about control and they're very transactional because they need to control the external world and the variables to constantly close that gap, not to have the realization of the differentiation there. And also because of this, the narcissist is in a constant state of performance. They're constantly overriding this fact that there's me and then there's the other. There's a separateness and other people have their own autonomy and agency. To realize this separateness becomes a point of humiliation for the narcissist. And again, humiliating because it's demonstrating to the person with this kind of personality disorder that they actually don't have the kind of power that they think they have or that they wish they could have. So this boundary that exists between people becomes a source of constant narcissistic injury to the narcissist. But Saturn's not just boundary between people. Saturn's also the harsh and the brutal boundary between reality and fantasy. And this takes us to part 5, which is about how Saturn, as the structure of reality, is absolutely non-negotiable. And this is because reality has rules, such as gravity, time, cause and effect with all of its consequences, limitation of abilities, limitations of knowledge, the fact that things take time. Like you could be with someone with this personality disorder and there's a sense of entitlement that they should be a doctor, for example, when they haven't gone to medical school. Saturn says not everything you think that you want and desire is possible. So these are the Saturnian truth and they are non-negotiables. So what that means is that from Saturn's perspective, what its symbolism is saying, it does not care about or facilitate fantasies. For example, if you think about it, our self-image to a great degree is part of our personal fantasies, even in a healthy mind. And our sense of self-image and self-concept is constantly being challenged by the world. Reality pushes back against us. So reality doesn't account for that subjective interpretation and perception that we have. And in this way, reality is not considerate or personal. This is why Saturn's been called harsh, cruel, brutal, cold, objectifying. And this comes to a complete clash with the personality of the narcissist. And that's because the core center of the narcissist, who it is actually a false self. And this false self has this notion that I am in total control. What it is about me, there's total specialness here. There's total exceptionality, and I am exempt from the general rules of reality because I am special. There's a grandiose self because it's a false self. And what does Saturn do? Just downright denies all of this. Saturn says to the narcissist over and over throughout their lifetime, hey, you live in the same world as everyone else. And to the narcissist, instead of learning from this, maturing, gaining some sense of humility, learning how to cooperate and negotiate with the world, they feel an existential insult that even God has forsaken them. And this very concept leads us to section 6, which is the mechanism of narcissistic personality. And this mechanism is called the grandiosity gap. The grandiosity here is referring to that inflated self-notion that the narcissist has and who the narcissist actually is as a human being. And Saturn is one of those planets that can show all of us where this gap exists. You know, we think we're this type of person, we think we're like this and like that. And then somewhere along the line in our story, we hit our head against the wall. And Saturn does this in a very simple way. And that's because Saturn has to do with measurement of things. Saturn can bring this notion of comparison, evidence to show you what is. Like for example, at work, you might make the claim that I'm best at my job. And all that is required is to start putting some sort of a comparison to measure abilities And we could very fast, very quickly see that we don't measure up to some standard that we're claiming that we're standing in. This is another way that Saturn's constantly exposing that gap between fantasy and reality. That's why Saturn's been related to negativity. Like, we can have a self-talk that's negative, we can get that kind of a feedback from the world. Saturn's messages of reality or things like, you're not competent enough, or at least you're not as competent as you believe you are. This is not your skill set. People don't see you the way you imagine them seeing you. You're not exceptional, and you're not an exception here. And if you think about it, these are kind of neutral messages. And that's because it's part of all of our lived experiences. We all experience this at some point. And it's just reality exposing us to reality, showing us the gap between what's real and what is of our own making in our own mind, without basis in reality. And when we reflect back, it's not like a one-time event. This is ongoing. This is kind of the dialogue of reality. It's the ongoing condition of being human. If it wasn't, why do we have goals? Why are we always striving? Why is there competition? We even have games trying to prove who's better, who's stronger, who's faster. But when it comes to the narcissist, they can't receive these messages of Saturn, of reality, in a neutral way. And why is that? Because the false self depends on inflation just to survive. Every truth that reality expresses to the narcissist experiences this as attack. Every limit becomes a point of humiliation. Every disappointment becomes an injury. I mean, if you have ever been in a dynamic with a narcissist and something like the concept of competition comes up, it's not cool. The reactions are not cool. What they do is not cool. It's just insane. Like, again, go back to that narcissist and tell them, dude, you don't have the skill set. You didn't even go to med school. What are you saying? That you can be a doctor? They will lose their minds. They'll sit right in front of you and start screaming, yelling that narcissistic rage of, who do you think you are to tell me that I'm not a doctor? I can't be a doctor. They might not even be a doctor, but also like that I'm not a doctor. And that's why they say narcissists gaslight, but they're actually in that moment confabulating again, just filling in the gap with what they think is real, which is their fantasy, that inflated, grandiose self coming in to talk for them. And if you think about it, this ongoing condition of reality, where we're all subject to it, creates a psychological environment for the narcissist that just saturates their life. And this is what's been called the ambient narcissistic injury. And now we'll discuss this in part 6 very briefly. So again, we ask, what's ambient narcissistic injury? So this is the idea that reality hurts the narcissist simply by existing, because every moment reveals to all of us our limits, our contradictions, our boundaries, reminder of what we can't do, what is actually real. And in many ways, reality is constantly disappointing us. And the narcissist, as I just explained, cannot tolerate any of this. So there's just this underlying feeling of irritation there at all times. Like, the narcissist is chronically irritated by life, by existence, by reality, by your existence. Like, sometimes a narcissist will want to know why you exist. You're just irritating him or her or them. Your existence and reality itself is a disappointment to the narcissist. It's a source of frustration that makes them feel defensive. So when it comes to the narcissist, Saturn is not episodic. It's constant. That means constant irritation, constant disappointment, constant frustration. And you know what? We can get disappointed. We'll go through the disappointment. We'll sit there. We're like, okay, how do I learn from it? How do I do better? We heal from it and we move on. But if something is constant and chronic, it just accumulates. It produces pressure. Pressure produces more frustration. And then frustration produces aggression. This is what's happening to the narcissist at all times. There is no time to heal. It's just accumulating. And this is precisely why at the beginning of the video, I was saying that we cannot understand Mars without understanding the symbolism of Saturn as reality. And that's because the narcissistic rage being created is being created by this chronic pressure from Saturn. But we're going to explore Mars on its own episode in the next one. But now I want us to understand, well, okay, you have all this pressure, irritation, frustration. What happens? The narcissist actually collapses. And this is what we're going to discuss in part 7. And the collapse is a way of exposing the false self. So this is to say, when Saturn intrudes too sharply, when reality becomes undeniable, and it does happen to the narcissist. And when it's consistent, the fantasy actually starts to crack for the narcissist. And this is experienced as a psychological collapse. It's also known as narcissistic mortification. And this is when the narcissist starts to decompensate. This state is very much about shame and humiliation. Here, the narcissist cannot regulate their emotion anymore. I mean, narcissists generally have a hard time regulating emotion internally. A part of narcissistic rage is about regulating their emotion externally. But this collapse state, this state of mortification, comes with a lot of despair and self-destructiveness, because this is the moment that the fantasy of the false self cannot hold that sense of self-concept anymore. So the narcissist left very vulnerable, without protection. There's no buffer, no illusion, so the false self can overcompensate. And this collapse actually reveals something much deeper. And that's because, again, healthy people can come into a very brutal clash with reality too. And we also collapse, but there's a difference. With the narcissist, there is no one home. There is no real self. Because only if there is a real self there, are you able to sit there in that collapse state and start to negotiate with reality again? And I want to discuss this in part 8 in terms of what it means to have a no self. And we kind of need to understand, why is it that the narcissist doesn't have a self? What does that even mean? And the way I want to describe this is to bring the symbolism of the sun and Saturn together and talk about the polarity that exists between them. Because we're trying to understand these in terms of astrological symbols, right? And then in astrology, Sun and Saturn have this natural polarity. For example, the sun represents the self, center of being, a healthy ego. So speaking about inner coherence, which then gives us a sense of agency and inner authority. Saturn, on the other hand, is talking about limits, consequences, and Saturn's talking about external reality. In the planetary friendships, the way that these two planets are conceptualized, Sun is seen as the king, as the ruler over the people. Saturn is the people, power for the people, by the people. So they got this clashing, oppositional dynamic. But if you think about it, both are necessary for the formation of an internal self. It's architecture that is actually healthy, because the sun in us says, this is who I am. And Saturn says, all right, now this is the world that you, the you of who I am, has to go and live in. And identity is forming where these two concepts are meeting, that separateness that I was talking about earlier. Why would you need an identity if there was no separation between you and another? Our identity is stemming from our healthy ego, so we make ourselves an identification marker in the world based on our own self-concept of how we want to be perceived by the world, and then that's the way the world comes and negotiates with us. So when this dynamic of internal and external is properly set, we have identities that are coherent. We can negotiate our sense of self. But the narcissist doesn't possess this healthy self-sun concept. And I described this extensively in episode 1, which was about both sun and moon. And I described the narcissist as something that resembles a black sun. And that means rather than radiating outwards from its own strong inner core, the narcissist has an empty core, where the narcissist is essentially just a mask, a persona, with nothing behind it, no self behind it. And this is why, just colloquially, people talk about narcissists as vampires. There's an emptiness that they need to fill. There is no self. Like it's been said that narcissists can do this thing that feels like identity theft. They steal other people's identities. They have this chameleon-like quality. And that's because there is no consistent self-concept behind that mask. So they can shift. They can take in other people's contents. People who possess a strong sense of self can't actually do that. What the narcissist possesses is a false self, is a fantasy self. And this self is inflated and very fragile because it's just like a hologram, an illusion that exists there. It's like a hologram that gets externalized and it's very performative. It's not coming from the core. This external persona is not connected to its own interiority. And the reason for this is because the ego is actually not cohesive. Like people are like, narcissists have big egos. No, they don't. A healthy person has an ego. As I was saying, that's the way you actually bring your inner content out in the world and have an interaction with it. If your ego is healthy, you have a healthy interaction with the world. If you have an unhealthy ego, your interaction with the world is generally negative because that's the kind of feedback that you're constantly getting. With the narcissist, there is no ego, or it's just not cohesive. They can change from situation to situation. Like if you think about it, we don't know who's in the backstage. And that means that there's no integrated identity there, capable of negotiating truth, integrating limits, accepting imperfections. Narcissists cannot accept imperfections. If they see it in themselves, they go through this whole thing of confabulation, not to see it. If they see imperfection in you, the reaction, it's absurd. And they definitely cannot adapt to consequences. You cannot expose a narcissist to a consequence without you getting a severe lashback on the other end of it. And that's because there's no healthy, consistent, constant inner core. That's the self. And believe it or not, Saturn and reality requires a very strong self. If you don't have a strong self, reality demolishes you. As much as Saturn and Sun are not friends in planetary friendships, they actually need each other to reinforce each other's symbols and existential functions. And think about it, Saturn wants us to have a strong sense of self because Saturn speaks of maturity. And what is maturity a lot of times is about the ability to be accountable and also a strong sense of self that can accept humility. We ultimately get the ability to mature up, but the narcissist's inner structure is not formulated in a way where it can accommodate any of these functions. So for the narcissist, Saturn, especially that part of Saturn that's about reality, Saturn is an enemy. Humility is a threat. Accountability is a form of suffocation. So Saturn is a form of annihilation rather than becoming stronger and more coherent and more mature. In a sense, there's nobody really home there to have some sort of a sober quality to be able to deal with Saturn. The fantasies of the narcissist, which is itself is a fantasy, is under threat at all times. Like Saturn's reality is constantly asking us to negotiate ourselves, negotiate with the world, with the other. But the narcissist has nothing to negotiate with. This is why it's frail and fragile in relation to reality. So let's just bring everything into conclusion for this video to see how Saturn acts as the existential antagonist to the narcissist. And we got to remember, in a lot of ways, Saturn is the world. We live in the world of reality. Throw a ball up, it always comes back down. Day one, you look like a cute little peanut. Year 100, you will look like a raisin. This is just reality. This is Saturn. The tangible world, the physical world, has a set of rules and laws that transcend all of our imagination, our desires, needs, and wants. Life is full of limitations. Parisa might want to fly, flap her wings, and go around the globe. Parisa will never grow wings and she will never fly. This is a limitation set by the world. And every time Parisa does something wrong, there are consequences. Whether Parisa wants or not, time will pass by. And sometimes your video gets cut off midway. And that there's separateness. Reality, the nature of reality is that this, you guys remember this Kinder Surprise like thingy? And the pen are separate and they're different. They have different functions. We cannot change these realities. There are laws to reality that it refuses to bend. And the narcissist rejects all of this, even though it's objective truth in front of it. And this is also one of the reasons why narcissists feel persecuted by reality. How dare does it do something that I can't be a doctor today? I don't know why I keep using the word doctor. I don't know, like train engineer, whatever. But this is also why they see other people as threats. Your capabilities, because Saturn's bringing that concept of measurement and comparison all the time to show you reality. Reality in general feels humiliating to the narcissist. The consequences of it feel cruel. And this is why truth to the narcissist, truth of what is real, your reality, reality of another person, reality of the natural world, can feel unbearable. The boundaries feel annihilating to them. And this is because Saturn's constantly confronting them and saying, you cannot reshape me. I shape you. You do not shape me. And again, this brings us back to Mars, right? Saturn's constantly creating pressure, tension, and stress for the narcissist. It's injuring the narcissist. It's exposing the narcissist. And that's how it's going to lead us to the next archetype that we're going to explain, Mars as narcissistic rage, and other qualities of the narcissist that's related to Mars, such as revenge, retaliation, attack, and in general, what narcissistic abuse is about. That will be the content of the next video. And I think my eye will really start like twitching like this the entire video. I said it in the comments before I made this video that every time I write about this topic or talk about it, my eyes like in the background in the socket is twitching. It's a stressful topic to talk about. And just to go back, Saturn is the wound because reality is constantly wounding the narcissist. And when we go to Mars, we'll see Mars is the reaction to this wound. And again, if you want to know more about this, like what about the other planets previous to all of this? I've already, as I mentioned, covered Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and we will come back to cover Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn again. And before signing off, if you guys like the content of this video, please do like, subscribe, share, and comment. And I'd love to know that if you have come into a dynamic, a relational dynamic with a narcissist, what your experiences have been, impart your wisdom, tell us how you dealt with it, as well as your suggestions for the upcoming videos. I'm always open to suggestions. And if you want your own chart reading, you can go to the description box below. You'll see my email there, or you can go to parisayazdi.com for more information. And now a final closing remark. Hard to make one for such a topic. But I guess if you are in a relational dynamic with the narcissist, my wish for you is to recognize yourself, to summon yourself, which gets fragmented when you've been in a relationship with the narcissist, to summon your own will, to eventually somehow get to a point where there is no contact. That is the only way to save yourself. And there's another thing I want to actually say before I log off here. I'm leaning forward to the mic, trying to figure out how to word this. It's hard to have compassion for the narcissist because of the chaos they create, the hurt that they bring. But at the end of the day, even the narcissist is somebody's daughter or son. And if we trace this back to its origin, it was out of the narcissist's hands. And using that word in itself is very problematic, but just for the sake of economy of words. Because if it was nurture, it was out of the narcissist's hands. If it was nature, the narcissist could not do anything if it's a genetic component. So on some level, we do have to see the human underneath all of it too, even though that does not mean that we stay in that world and we harm ourselves. You are allowed to go no contact. And I'll leave the video here, sending you much love. Till next time. See you guys in Mars's video.